few years ago, while sitting at the breakfast table reading the newspaper, the Indianapolis Star, Joanne got mad at a cartoon that was in it and canceled our subscription. I have never in all my life known Joanne to be mad at a person, but if you're a corporation, watch out. So now we subscribe to the New York Times, and I've downloaded an app so I can read the New York Times on my phone, which was wonderful right up until COVID began and the Times started publishing the number of COVID cases in America. After the vaccine rolled out, the cases were dropping. I could see it every day on the little scorecard they kept. And now the Delta variant is out and the cases are rising up 120% in the last 14 days. I must admit, it's been freaking me out a little bit. I read this week, because we're so used to dangers coming at us being large and overpowering, a car hurtling down the road or a nuclear weapon. We're used to big explosive threats to our well-being. I read the other day that if all the COVID virus in the world were collected, it would fit inside a Coke can. Fit inside a Coke can. It is a marvel of nature that something so small can be so deadly and destructive. I'm a bit like Woody Allen when it comes to death. I'm not afraid of it. I just don't want to be there when it happens. I'm thinking this week, I was thinking, well, maybe the answer is not to read, to remain blissfully ignorant and unaware of the lurking dangers of life. Maybe that's what I'll do, I told myself. And then I thought, no, you can't do that. The answer is to be informed of danger, but not be crippled by the fear that so often accompanies awareness. We see this all the time. Just this week, I was at the library, and there was a neat little guy there with his mom. I began chatting with him, asking him if he was having a good summer and whether he liked school. And we were just having this wonderful conversation. He was telling me all about his summer and what he had done, when his mother, who had apparently been steeped in all of these stories about child abduction, grabbed his hand and snatched him away from me, saying to him, "How many times have I told you not to talk with strangers?" And I thought to myself, stranger? I'm not a stranger. It's me, Phil, your old buddy. What dreadful advice to give a child. That's going to be one lonely kid. I'm grateful my parents never taught me that. In fact, now that I think about it, they did just the opposite. I wonder what they were wanting to have happen to me. But my parents never told me that because, of course, every friend I've ever had, and this is true for you too, every single friend I've ever had was once a stranger. Fear can make us weird. Sadly, religion has not comported itself well in this regard. Religion, which should encourage confidence, wields fear like a weapon. The Bible starts out right off the bat with this fear as a weapon, the Adam and Eve story. It's a second creation story. The first one, God spoke it, the world into creation, which is a creator story. Writers and speakers just love that God could just speak and something could be created. We've often labored under that same misconception. The second story is much more practical. God has to work at it. So God creates this garden and places Adam in it. God hasn't made Eve yet. It's just Adam and Eve hanging out there in the garden. And what does God say to Adam? Do you remember? You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day you eat of it. Wait for it, here it is. The day you eat of it, you shall die. You shall die. Of course, God really didn't say this to Adam. We have a more sophisticated understanding of human origins than the folks who created this story thousands of years ago did. But here's what's important. Whoever the first person was to tell this story obviously believed that God used fear to control human behavior. Fear is a potent weapon. Right before Joanne canceled our subscription to the Star, a man wrote into the Billy Graham column, which just kept going and going and going, that his favorite song was "I Did It My Way." It's probably a phony letter, because who would write Billy Graham to tell him their favorite song? I mean, that's just weird. And not to put too fine a point on it, Billy Graham had been dead for a year. So it made me kind of suspicious. But the person purporting to be Billy Graham quoted the book of Proverbs: "Whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed." Note the use of fear, the tamping down, the dire warning against going one way. Fear makes us weird. And even worse, have you ever noticed that what we were taught to fear as children, we will hate as adults? Fear almost always ends up with hate. First, we are taught to fear a group of people, and then we grow to hate them. And when religions use fear, it's as if God blesses our hatred, as if fear and hatred were God's will and God's desire all along. We've heard it said, fear is a great motivator. I don't believe that. Far more often, fear cripples us, causing us to reject new and necessary changes important to our growth. Far more often, fear dehumanizes us, causing us to reject entire classes and groups of people. Far more often, fear isolates us, causing us to reject community the moment we need it the most. I was reading a wonderful book recently written by a man named Huston Smith. Smith is best known as the author of the book, The World's Religions, which is just a classic religious text. But in 2012, as an elderly man, he wrote a beautiful memoir titled "And Lives Rejoicing," Chapters from a Charmed Life. He describes traveling to a conference in Tanzania and having to drive across the Serengeti Plain, which was and still is inhabited largely by lions and Maasai warriors. He had been warned to avoid both groups. Well into his journey, the car he was driving broke down and he was stranded there in the desert. He was driving a car made in France, so it was bound to happen. He ate the last of his food, drank the last of his water, and decided to venture out for help, despite having been warned not to leave the relative safety of his car. As he exited his car, two Maasai warriors appeared on the horizon and began trotting toward him. They didn't speak English. He obviously didn't speak their language, but he was able to communicate that his car was broken down. And they laughed and then trotted away. A few hours later, they returned, but this time there were a dozen of them. Smith feared greatly for his safety, trying to decide which would be worse, being eaten by lions or killed by Maasai warriors. But listen to his description of what happened next. As the sun set that evening, one of the most bizarre scenes that had ever unfolded on the Serengeti Plain took place. A team of Maasai warriors were pushing a dilapidated Renault across the trackless Serengeti with a lost American scholar sitting comfortably behind the wheel. 6 miles they pushed him to a remote school where he was able to get help and resume his journey. And then he wrote this beautiful sentence. Beware of the fears that blind us to the unity that binds us. Beware of the fears that blind us to the unity that binds us. Beware. It's been a difficult and painful year. We were hoping it would be over. The New York Times tells us otherwise. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't speak with scientific authority about COVID. But I hope I'm speaking with some semblance of philosophical authority when I urge us not to spend our days locked away and cowering, crippled by fear. There is, after all, another way to understand the story of Adam and Eve. Not that they were disobedient, but that they were brave. And being brave, willingly absorbed the knowledge of good and evil, which led not to their deaths. Remember, they didn't die immediately in the story. It led not to their death, but to their liberation. This week, may the fears that often chain us fall away.